In my home electronics lab, I've accumulated a small pile of unruly rolls, reels, spools, whatever you want to call them, of small hookup wire, both solid and stranded, as well as ones with a high strand count and a silicone rubber insulation, which make for good test leads or places where the temperature is going to be warmer and might melt the simple plastic insulations. Anyway, I figured that putting a few of them side by side, because they are small spools, and then having several of those would do the trick to get them up off the floor and more organized. The problem is, in my lab, at least within reach of my workbench, I couldn't think of any good place to put it. I did have one area kind of just behind my chair and to the right, where I had a small table holding some other things, mostly handheld meters of various kinds, and also some plastic storage bins with odds and ends, shrink tubing, and other tools and stuff. And I thought, well, that space above those isn't being used. If I can make a simple rack that'll fit there, and the foot of it will be held down by the storage bins, and it'll be up against the bookshelf that I use to store all my parts cabinets. That should be pretty stable, and then I can put some dowel rods on it to make the holders for the spools. So without any further ado, I'll start going through a slideshow of that. The first step is I figured that the largest reels, I'm going to try to call them spools here for consistency. So the largest spools were only about 3.5 inches in diameter, and I figured I would need up to 9 of those, using at least 8 of them, having a ninth for a spare. And with the width I had available front to rear, in other words, I could have 3 rows or 3 columns of those, and up to 3 spools per column. And here's a piece of paper that I had marked out with the size of the area I had to work with, and I was experimenting with different layouts and spacings with some cut to size pieces of craft paper. I had some scrap of some cheap 3/4 inch plywood from Home Depot. I'd bought 4x8 sheet of it a while back and used part of it on another project. I actually think that was the job I did late last year, where I made a holder for all my paint cans and things like that. And so I had some of that left, and there was enough of it to make the whole thing out of that. And I don't have an intermediate photo, but here's a photo where I've cut rabbet joints on my router table on the 2 pieces of wood, the one that'll be the base and the one that'll be the riser or the vertical part. Here's with the base to the left and the riser on the right, showing how their respective rabbet joints are going to align. And here's with the 2 of them together. I have to do a little trimming. I didn't set the router table up quite right, so I have to trim the ends off slightly to make them fit a little tighter together at the rabbet. Here the 2 pieces are joined with wood glue and also a fair number of brad nails, and also this one angled piece that joins the edges, but only on one side, because if I put it on both sides, it'll be harder to get at the bins that'll set on the base of this thing when it's in its real position. And that's also assembled with wood glue and brad nails. Just to make sure that the rabbet joint is nice and tight, I also have a couple of beam clamps, which are shown at the top of the photo, pulling it all together. Here are a couple more angles on that, including my brad nailer in the front of the first photo. Here I put my paper pattern down on the part of the riser that will eventually have the dowels, and I used a punch to mark the center hole locations, or hole center locations. Then I went to work on it with my orbital sander, just giving it a first pass to get it pretty smooth. I still have to drill the holes for the dowels, so I'm going to have to give it a second pass at least in that area. And here's where I've used a Forstner bit to make 1/2-inch diameter holes for each of the posts. Now here's where I was a little bit dumb. This is far too big to put on my drill press, and I couldn't think of any other device I had that would allow me to make precisely vertical holes, so I just used my hand drill and did my best to line it up by eye. I think I got it slightly off. In retrospect, what I should have done is got a nice block of wood, perhaps even part of a 2x4 or something like that, and put that on the drill press and made a nice bore through it that would be nice and vertical, and then lay that on the riser of this rack and use that to align the drill. That might have worked better, but I didn't do it that way. I had some scrap of some hardwood dowel of the kind that I think is sold to make things like railings out of. And I cut off some pieces that were 5/8 of an inch thick. You can see the pencil marks here. I used my bandsaw to actually cut them apart. And these are to make for reinforcing flanges for where the dowels exit the riser, just to give them a little more stability and strength to the glue joint. I used the same 1/2-inch Forstner bit to make holes in all of these wooden flanges. And then here's a test fit with the 1/2-inch dowel that I used. I had to buy 3 4-foot lengths of it to get enough for this project, and I had to make sure they fit. Oddly, one of the 3 pieces was a little big. It doesn't matter for most things, but where it's going to go through these 1/2-inch holes, I had to sand it lightly to get it in there. Here I have the 1/2-inch dowel cut into 12-inch long pieces, 9 of them. For the ends of the dowels that will not be going into the riser, that's the end that the spools will be slipped over, and I plan to put a fender washer on there secured with a 632 screw into a brass insert drilled into and threaded in and epoxied. So the first step was to make sure I was going to drill a hole that was concentric with the dowels, and I just took a scrap of 1/2-inch plywood and drilled a small pilot hole, and then used the Forstner bit to drill about 2/3 the way through that to make this recess. And the other side of the plywood still has the original small hole. Here I have the pilot drill that'll be used to enlarge for the brass inserts, and I have it taped so it can go through the plywood, which is my alignment jig, and then into the 1/2-inch dowel by the correct amount. And the plywood here is just clamped into a bench vise. Here you can see how the dowels go into the 1/2-inch recess, and thereby it aligns it with the pilot hole so that the drill bit will go right into the center of the dowels. My mistake here is that I didn't take into account how soft a wood the plywood was, so after I started making a few holes, the drill was making the pilot hole slightly oval, and therefore the holes were sagging a little bit out of center. They were no longer concentric with the dowel, but it wasn't by enough that it messed it up. Here's a typical 1/2-inch dowel with the concentric pilot hole drilled in the end of it. Here all 9 dowels have the pilot holes enlarged to the correct diameter to put in the brass inserts. That's 632 size brass inserts. And unfortunately I didn't have the correct driving screw and lock nuts for a 632. I should have picked them up at the hardware store, but I thought I had it already. So I just had to drive them in using the screws that will go in them eventually. And so here are the 9 dowels with the brass inserts driven into them. I lined the holes with a little bit of epoxy before I put them in there. So the problem with these things is, especially in softer woods, if you don't do something to anchor them, when you undo the screw that goes into the insert, sometimes it just backs the insert out, which is not what you want. so I always put a little epoxy in there. Here I'm using some wood glue to get things ready to drive the dowels into their holes in the risers, and the wooden flange is already in place and ready to be tapped into the exact position. And here all of the dowels are in their respective holes, and the flanges are tapped down flush against the riser, and the excess glue wiped up. And here I've given the whole thing, including the dowels and both sizes of all the plywood, a quickly slapped on coat of clear satin varnish, polyurethane varnish. I've got a couple heater fans on it. One of them that's not in the picture. Let it go overnight. So here I've cleared an area on the floor of my lab. I moved the little, I think it's a TV tray table really, but it's just a little auxiliary table. And I keep things like my deoxit and stuff on there, as well as some of the little handheld meters. Anyway, I moved it over a couple inches and then cleared the floor temporarily. And the riser part of the spool rack will go up against the side of this nicely finished bookshelf that I had built really just to hold the cabinets full of electronic parts. So I've dragged the spool rack up from the basement, and I'm getting ready to put it in position. And there it is. I deliberately made the dowels no longer than I thought would get in the way as I try to navigate around the end of the shelf to get over into my recording studio part of the room. And here I've put the storage bins, there's actually 3 of them that I normally keep in this position, back on top of the base of the rack. And that's why the dowel rods start so far up in order to allow room for those to be there. And I also have the top of the rack's riser just a little bit short of the top of the cabinet that's next to it. Here's how the little 632 screw goes through an 832 fender washer, and that's there to make the end of the dowel big enough that the spools can't slide off of it easily. Of course, these 632 screws are going into those brass inserts I put in earlier. Okay, there are all my spools of wire, organized by color and type. The things I use least go towards the back, bottom. The things I use most commonly are in the front face of it. And here's just another angle of the same thing. And another one. You can see how junky this room is. I use pretty much every square foot of floor space that I don't actually have to walk on for storage of various odds and ends, including a lot of the Heath kits that I've been restoring over the last couple of years. I haven't figured out good storage spaces for them yet, so a lot of them are just sort of stacked up in rows against the walls. Often with their manuals and other documentation just piled helter-skelter on top of it. In other words, as the British would say, bliss.